Hello to everybody joining us today. Welcome. Welcome to Changing Point's webinar this afternoon. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to join us today. So do get yourself comfortable, make yourself a cup of tea, make sure you've got a glass of water ready for today's session. And we're very much looking forward to getting started soon. For those of you just joining us now, it's great to see so many of you coming into the virtual room here with us today. A warm welcome for myself and Nicky. It's great to have you here. Please come in, make yourself comfortable. We'll be starting the webinar in about 60 seconds once we've allowed everybody to join us and log in and get themselves comfortable and ready. So bear with us just for another couple of minutes and then we'll be ready to go. You can see we've got several people joining us now, so that's fantastic. Welcome, welcome. Looking forward to talking you through today's webinar on well-being and burnout in leadership. We're going to start officially in just under a minute, once everybody's had a chance to join us in the room today. Okay, great. Lots of people in now, so I think it's a good time for us to get started and do the official welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today for Changing Point's webinar, today on the topic of the unseen battles of change, combating burnout and prioritising your well-being as a leader. One of the challenges that often arises when we're leading change is that we're often required to navigate teams through uncertainty and ambiguity over a significant period of time. And those conditions for change can sometimes lead to unseen or underappreciated impacts on our mental, physical, emotional and interpersonal well-being as leaders. And this can cascade then into our teams. So today's session is all about really shining a spotlight on the often overlooked aspect of change management, the personal well-being of the leader. You might be here today to think about your own well-being as a leader. You might be joining to think about how you can best support leadership well-being within your organisation. Today's session will address both. And we'd encourage you as we go through today's session to please use the Q&A box to share any questions that you have and that you would like myself and Nicky to address as we reach the end of today's webinar. We're going to be talking you through science-led approaches with practical strategies and hopefully some actionable steps that you can take away off the back of today's session. In particular, we're going to be looking through the 12 stages of burnout through the lens of leading through change and uncertainty. We're going to discuss the fact that we experience the signs and symptoms of stress and burnout in different ways, based in parts on the fact that we all have different personality traits and preferences. Nicky and I are also going to bring to the session today some of our own personal experiences, as well as some of the themes that we see in the clients that we work with, who are often leading through times of significant and stressful challenge and change. And then finally, we're going to be exploring our brain's amazing ability to adapt and grow and how we can use this to help us learn and build resilience. What we're going to be looking at today is not how to address burnout once we have reached this point, but to hopefully help us recognize and become more familiar with some of the steps that we might walk along the way so that we can feel more empowered to choose a different route. And while we hope that today's session is going to offer you valuable insight into how you can spot the signs and symptoms of approaching burnout in yourself and in others. It should not be used as a replacement to engaging professional services and advice as needed. So we will be providing a list of resources after today's webinar, should you need to seek any additional support after today's session. So before we get into the specifics about what we're going to be covering today, a brief introduction. First of all, to myself, for those of you who have not had the chance to meet before and who are new to the Changing Point webinar series, my name is Jayne Ruff. I'm a coaching and occupational psychologist with a real passion for supporting leadership wellbeing in the workplace. And I'm also the managing director here at Changing Point. And I'm joined today by Nicky Elliott, who I will hand the virtual mic over to now to give her own introduction and to get us into the content of today's webinar. So over to you, Nicky.
Thank you, Jayne. Hello, everyone. As Jayne said, I'm Nicky Elliott, and my work nowadays is as an empowerment and leadership coach, working closely with Changing Point for the last 12 months, but previously before that too. My career background is very much from corporate, so 20 years in financial services in various guises and in oil and gas as well. So the early part of my career was in HR and leadership development, and latterly in senior management. And just to echo Jayne's point, a professional interest in leadership well-being and my own personal experience of walking that path too through times of change over the course of that career. So again, something I'm very passionate about in terms of bringing awareness to this topic and the importance for ourselves and for the people that we lead. So delighted to be here. Thank you, Jayne. So just as we move into the content of the session then, as we approach these situations of change, feeling pressure and feelings of uncertainty, one of the best things that we can begin to do is to become witness to our thoughts, our feelings, emotions, and the physical sensations that we experience during those times. So to become really present to all of that that's going on and be able to recognize the changes in ourselves when those things are happening. And the more we do that, the more we'll be able to recognize them in others too. So in addition to that, when we notice that, our shoulders tense or our thoughts begin to race or whatever it might be, when we're aware of those things, they become the clues. Then we begin to choose or be able to choose how to respond in those moments of change and potential stress. So, what is burnout? The World Health Organization talks about burnout as a psychological syndrome caused by prolonged exposure to work-related stress with various causes. It's characterized, though, by 3 dimensions. Feelings, so physical feelings of energy depletion and exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, feelings of negativity or cynicism, specifically around the job, and over a period of time, perhaps gradually reduced efficacy, professional efficacy in one's work. It's important to note, though, that here where we talk about burnout, it refers specifically to this phenomenon in the occupational context. So if these types of things are occurring in other parts of someone's life, we ought not to assume it's connected to burnout. That said, if one is experiencing chronic workplace stress, it is inevitable almost that it will affect other parts of their life. But just to be very clear, when we talk about burnout here, we're talking about that workplace context. So this year's Mental Health UK Burnout Report, I think it's worth dwelling on some of these statistics. So this year, 9 in 10 UK adults report that they have experienced high or extreme stress in the past year. A fifth of workers, so 20% of workers, are saying they have hit their own version of burning point. And nearly half of UK working adults say that their employer doesn't have a plan in place to spot the signs of chronic stress and prevent burnout in employees. And it's just worth saying at this point, this is their understanding of whether there's a plan in place. So for those of us that are involved in leadership or indeed human resources, we may know that there's a policy. This is their experience of whether that policy is known to them, whether it's available to them, and whether it's actually enacted. So half of working adults say they don't know about that. So jumping into this model, the 12 stages of burnout, and as we go through, Jayne and I will do our best to bring this to life for you. So you'll see that the model will build as we go through in 4 quadrants. So in the early stages of burnout, and it's worth saying not everyone will go through this in the same order. It's not necessarily sequential, and people may move backwards and forwards through this model. But again, through my own experience, personally and professionally, this really does stand up to scrutiny in terms of these stages. So in the early stages, then, a compulsion to prove oneself. So a real belief that when we're feeling under this sense of pressure, we have to constantly demonstrate our worth. We have to work harder. For some people, even beginning to become a work addict and finding it difficult, more and more difficult to switch off from that. And of course, when we're so preoccupied with that compulsion to prove and to work harder and harder, almost inevitably, one begins to neglect their own needs. And that can look like an erratic sleep pattern, disrupted eating, could be overeating or not eating, and increasingly a lack of social interaction as all efforts and energy go into work. In the second part of this model, then, we can, when experiencing this, begin to blame others for problems, begin to even blame the stress itself. So that displacement of conflict, seeing things slightly differently than we normally would. Where we're talking here about revision of values, perhaps beginning to prioritize work over the things that in a different situation we would see as more important, perhaps family time and hobbies. And increasingly a denial of emerging problems. So perhaps intolerance as the stress level begins to rise, beginning to perceive others, collaborators or work colleagues as lazy or undisciplined because they're not also working the way that we may be. And increasingly pressure overspilling into other parts of life. So Jayne, is there anything you would add to that quadrant in terms of your experience professionally or personally?
Yes, Nicky, thank you for the invite to come in there. I think for that quadrant, one of the things that really jumps out to me, particularly when we're thinking about revision of values and denial of emerging problems, would be the word justification. I think justification it really comes to the fore within that quadrant. And what I mean by that is we might hear ourselves saying to ourselves, it's just a really busy period. I've got to work this hard because it's what's required of me at this moment in time, justifying that shift in revision of values and the denial of the emerging problems, justifying the fact that our single focus and attention has moved towards work and perhaps overwork and away from some of the other areas of life that are important to us.
Absolutely. Yeah, so true, so true. And also a belief that this is temporary, right? You know, it'll be okay when this project ends or whatever. And often we know it's not. So thanks, Jayne. So moving on to the third quadrant, increasingly when we find ourselves experiencing this, withdrawing from social interaction, seeking stress relief through things such as alcohol or drugs, or even for some people, you know, I've definitely worked with clients who will stay up late just watching another episode of Netflix because it just numbs the feeling of what they're trying to avoid, really. And behavioural change, so things that are out of character for you. So sometimes irritability, sometimes over familiarity, you know, something that just feels different to that person's normal way of operating. And eventually depersonalization. So here what we're talking about is beginning to see neither yourself or others as valuable. And that shows itself in many ways, particularly with self-criticism. That can really be quite damaging at this stage in that burnout cycle. And the fourth quadrant, increasingly feelings of inner emptiness, feeling and seeking relief through more of those activities like overeating, alcohol, drugs, things that we know normally aren't good for us, as a remedy almost to that feeling of emptiness inside. And depression. So again, feeling lost, feeling unsure, sometimes at this point questioning one's identity, and feeling like really there is only a bleak future ahead. And then the final stage, burnout syndrome. Here what we're talking about is a total mental and physical collapse, often and almost always, in fact, requiring full medical attention. So at this point, you're not likely to see someone operating as they normally would in work, if indeed they're able to be in work at all at this stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicky, for
Yeah,
talking us through the 12 stages.
great. Was there anything you wanted to add on that latter stage there, Jayne?
So I think the only thing I would add there is that in terms of how that can present itself is where we would once have found joy in certain activities and tasks, we're no longer able to access that. And so building on the points that you've shared already, Nicky, we might seek relief and remedy from unhelpful and perhaps even harmful other factors because we are unable to access what has once brought us that joy and fulfillment. And so based on that, now that we've covered the 12 stages of overwhelm, obviously where we want to shift the focus to now is some of the strategies that we can take to help us recognize and respond as early as possible to some of these stages that Nicky has just talked us through. And for that, I'd like to take us into the next part of the webinar today, where in this section, I'm going to touch very lightly on the biological functions of resilience to help demonstrate some of the psychological underpinnings of the different strategies that we're going to be recommending to you today. It is a huge topic, as you can imagine, and it's one that Nicky and I have already shared we're incredibly passionate about. So our hope would be that at some point in future we'd be able to talk to you in more detail on a one-to-one or group level about some of the content that we're going to be covering here today. But what I would like to do is start with a brief overview. So neuroplasticity, also known as neuroplasticity or brain plasticity, refers to our brain's remarkable ability to change and adapt the neural networks in such a way that they can rewire and reorganize how they respond and respond differently to a previous state. And when we're looking at that in particular in relation to burnout, we're also interested to think about the role of our amygdala, which is our emotional processing center within our brain, and also our prefrontal cortex, so the reasoning part of our brain. Also, the relationship between what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which we might know as the flight or fight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's our calm and rest and digest response. So all of these brain areas play an important part in how we function as human beings. The question that I'd like us to think about today is, how do we get the balance right. When we are on our way to burnout and we are recognizing some of those emotional and physical sensations and that feeling of depletion that Nicky has just talked us through, we are much more vulnerable to the emotional effects of ongoing new small stressors in our lives. We're less able to rationalize as we're less able to engage that prefrontal cortex, that reasoning part of our brain. And this can really leave us stressing the small stuff, quickly feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. We might start to see some physical sensations appearing too. So our weight might fluctuate, our fitness levels may be impacted, we might feel it in our gut, we might feel it in our sleep. The neurotransmitters that we release in our brain as well also impact the words that we use, the dialogue that we use to talk to ourselves, our self-talk, as we might call it. And so what we want to try and do and understand is how we can gain access to what let's call our positive neurotransmitters that can help us to manage some of these physical and emotional or mindset experiences and responses that we might have to stress and pressure. So how do we do this? Well, to start with, what I'd like to do is actually take us back to the questions that Nicky posed at the start of today's webinar, because often our response to the different thoughts, feelings, and sensations that we experience when we're under pressure and stress happen automatically. So as a starting point, and what we were looking to engage you in by introducing and posing these questions at the start of today's webinar, to gain access to these positive neurotransmitters, we need to increase our awareness of what our personal stress triggers are and the signs and the signals that tell us in our mind and our body that we're experiencing them, which are going to be unique and personal to us based on, for a starting point, our differences in personality traits and preferences. Then we need to be able to notice how we tend to respond to them. Particularly if we think about this within the context of overwhelm, being overwhelmed is a bit like having a circle with no end. So when we feel overwhelmed, we feel unable to do anything about that overwhelm, which means that because we're not doing anything about that overwhelm, we continue to feel overwhelmed. It feels like a bit of a vicious cycle. And when we take a step back from that, generally, overwhelm is something that builds up over time. So this cycle of overwhelm, the circle of overwhelm, is something that is building and building over time. We're going round and round this circle that feels like it has no end. The daily stress triggers that we come across tend to actually be manageable. We have it within us, most of us have it within us to manage those daily stress triggers. But when more significant stress gets added into the mix, so perhaps the change and uncertainty of change, if we're thinking about that within an organizational leadership perspective, or the buildup of these small stresses just becomes too much, this is when it no longer feels manageable. So what we would like to encourage us all to think about today is, what are our tipping points? Again, thinking about the fact that these tipping points and how we experience the tipping point for us is going to be different based on personality preference and personal context. Once we're in a position where we have greater awareness of what our tipping point is, and we're more aware of perhaps the signs and signals that tell us that we're approaching that tipping point, we're in a better position to be able to more consciously choose how to respond. And the tool that I would like to introduce us to today to support with that is what I call the 5-minute circuit breaker. And the 5-minute circuit breaker is a bit like taking a conscious pause amidst what can feel like chaos in order to check in with ourselves and reconnect with what is genuinely important to us. Some of us might think of this or be familiar with this as an act of mindfulness. I think the key thing to point out here is that it can be done very quickly. It's something that we can actually integrate into our everyday. That's not to say that that is necessarily going to feel comfortable at first. It might even feel a little bit forced at first if this is not something that we're used to doing. But if we get into the practice of doing it, it will become a habit, and that will be supported by those changes in the neural pathways that I talked about earlier. So let's explore how we might approach this 5-minute circuit breaker. What I'm keen to highlight is that when we've got that sense of being overwhelmed and it feels like we're unable to change it, what we're not trying to do is completely eradicate that sense of overwhelm, but find ways to transform it into something that feels more manageable to us in that moment in time. Keeping in mind as well that every action that we engage in has an impact. Some actions are going to nurture and nourish us, some actions are going to deplete us. And what nurtures and nourishes us and what depletes us, again, will be unique and personal to us. So keeping in mind what you know works or not for you. So the question that I would like to pose to you, or the couple of questions I would like to pose to you and encourage you to bring into that circuit breaker, is when these different thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations show up for you, how else could you choose to respond? And in particular, what's the smallest thing that you can commit to doing that will help short circuit your current thinking pattern? Taking this short pause just helps us redirect our attention and energy in the moment to where it's needed. And the outcome is that we do start to build new neural pathways that will act over time as a bit of an inbuilt stress response to the strategy, and a strategy, sorry, that we can actually use time and time again when we are faced with these similar stimuli in future. The more that we do this, the stronger that connection becomes. So we're building that little inbuilt response to stress. It's an inbuilt resilience tool that we can draw on time and time again. I want to also just share with you a few ideas. So bringing us back to this idea of accessing our positive neurotransmitters on the whistle stop tour that we have been on in relation to this today. Just to try and make this actionable and to bring it to life, I wanted to share some small acts that we might want to reflect on and think about in our 5-minute circuit breaker that will help us to access and release these positive neurotransmitters and support in developing our resilience as we lead through times of change and uncertainty. So the first is how we may want to access dopamine. There are various different ways that we can do that. And if we think about this with that dual perspective of building our well-being and also thinking about that well-being within the context of leadership, celebrating the small wins, celebrating progress during times of change is incredibly important. Giving and receiving praise actually releases dopamine. So being mindful of opportunities to give praise, to give positive feedback and ask for it too during times of change. Of course, looking after ourselves, thinking about our self-care and well-being is an important part of accessing that dopamine. For serotonin, social support and networks, and I think this is crucial to think about within the context of leadership well-being. What does our support network look like within our organization? And are we thinking enough about how we create a support network for our leaders who are leading through times of change, so that they're not just coming together to talk about the change, but they're also coming together to talk about the impact on that change on them and how they are feeling about the change, where the challenges are for them personally, as well as the challenges that they face professionally. Taking time for breaks and fresh air and encouraging physical activity. Melatonin, endorphins, and acetylcholine. Certain foods to take, certain foods to avoid. So eggs, fish, all good. Avoiding the spicy foods at bedtime, avoiding the tomato pizza at bedtime, citrus fruits would also be one to avoid. Mindfulness and meditation and breathing and muscle relaxation are great, but of course, linking us back into that 5-minute circuit breaker, that doesn't have to be something that takes a long time or something that has to push us too far out of our comfort zone. It really is about just taking that moment to pause and reset from time to time and finding a way that that works for us. Time away from blue screens, putting down the the devices before bedtime, really important, particularly if we're feeling busy, not feeling like we have to be on our email right up until the moment that we switch off for the night. Having clear work and personal life boundaries and clarity on values. Again, when we come into a place where we might start to feel the temptation to refocus those values too much towards our work, actually having done some of the thinking beforehand about what matters to us and what's important to us, can act as a bit of an anchor to bring us back. Engaging in the things that we love, and laughter. Comedy is such a great resource for us to use in order to tap into some of those positive neurotransmitters, and in particular endorphins. Nicky, is there anything that you would pick out in particular from that list, or anything that you would add to build on what I've shared there?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I think there's a couple of things. I think just in the social supports and network, the more we make opportunities for leaders and people who are experiencing change to come together and realize that they're not the only one that's feeling that way, that's immensely supportive and helpful. And just referring back to my own experience of this, when you're experiencing burnout, it can be incredibly hard to identify what those things are that bring you joy and bring you laughter, and the things you love. So just remembering the very, very smallest things, and just noticing, even the color of the sky and things like that, which relates back to mindfulness, but not making it too complicated. Just noticing the tiny things. And something that's really helpful that I use with my clients is, even in a meeting where you're feeling those things starting to come over, just pressing back into your chair, 2 feet on the floor, and just grounding yourself in the moment, and taking a deep breath or two, and then choosing how to respond, what to say, what not to say, is incredibly helpful. And as Jane said, that is not even a 5-minute circuit breaker, it's a 30-second circuit breaker, but just gives you that pause, is so valuable.
Thank you, and not overcomplicating it, I think, is something I would fully endorse. Thanks, Nicky. So just finally, sorry, I should also mention the seeking professional help as the obvious actionable step that we want to circle back to and make sure is clear. If that is the point that you're at, it's always important to ask for help when that help is needed. So just bringing this all together now, Nicky and I have mentioned a couple of times the work that we do with leaders, and in particular the work that we do with leaders when they're facing the stressors and challenges of leading through change. One way in which we do that is through ChangingPoint's Universal Change Leadership Programme. Leadership wellbeing and building resilience is one part of that, as you can see on the slide here, coming under momentum. There are a whole host of other areas of change leadership development work that we do as part of that program and beyond to support leadership behavioral change and their emotional and interpersonal development and well-being. It might be that after today's session, thinking specifically about today's topic, that you want to pick up with us on the one-to-one support that we do, in particular to support leadership well-being. If leadership well-being and burnout is a topic that is resonating personally for you, or that you're recognizing as a theme that's occurring within your organization today. And of course, both Nicky and I would be delighted to have that conversation with you. To support that, we're going to be sharing some resources and also a couple of offers off the back of today's session to hopefully keep this conversation going. So please do keep an eye out for those appearing in your inbox soon. But that takes us now to our Q&A session. Nicky, have we got any questions that have come through to get us started?
We do, Jane, yeah. So I'll just read this one out for you. If you've experienced chronic stress, then had a break from it, and things got better for a while, and then the same sort of stressful environment arises again, are you likely to jump back into a later stage of the burnout cycle, i.e. shortcut some of the earlier stages and move straight into a more hardcore stage?
That's a great question, and I don't think there is a one size fits all answer to that. Would be the honest response. It's probably going to depend, because it's going to depend a little bit on the work that you have done previously to support you with your chronic stress. It's going to depend in part in the context that you find yourself in now, and within that context, the support levels that you feel that you've got. So back to that importance of the support network. So possibly would be the answer, but not necessarily. I think to be mindful and aware of it, and be ready and prepared to seek the advice and the support that you know that you need, if that is something that reoccurs for you, would be absolutely the preparation that would be advisable to do, if that is something that you recognise is reoccurring for you. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to jump further into that cycle. Thank you for that question.
And then, is leaving the job too extreme an option to recover from burnout? I'm happy to take that one.
Yeah, go, Nicky.
So, not necessarily. I think, it might be an extreme option, but I wouldn't necessarily go there immediately. Look at the support structures, get some support medically, if that feels like the right course for you. But normally there are things you can do that don't involve having to leave a job. That said, if you've done the work around your values and you've implemented some of these things and it's still causing you an issue, that might be something that you want to consider, but I wouldn't necessarily advocate throwing that up in the air immediately. There's probably other things you can explore before getting to that. And some of the things that Jayne was talking about in terms of the work that we do at Changing Point would definitely support you to work through that, as opposed to jumping straight to that option. We have another one here. Do you have any tips for quickly identifying early signs of burnout in senior colleagues, given that not everyone in these positions wants to show any vulnerability?
That's a great question. As is the case, I would say, with so many psychological factors in the workplace, conversation and connection is really key. So thinking about how you are creating an environment where leaders have the opportunity to speak with someone who is trusted within the workplace environment, and to have those conversations on a regular basis, likely on a one-to-one level, so that you're in as best a possible position to be able to identify some of those early signs of burnout, where it may well be that the leader in question isn't going to share or demonstrate any of those signs and symptoms within a group setting, and actually may be very capable at masking some of those signs and symptoms within a group setting in order to maintain the professional identity that they want to project to the organization. So connection, communication, having one-to-one conversations and support, having a frequency of contact, creating an environment that allows for and encourages that type of connection and conversation within the workplace would be something that I would say should be encouraged in any organizational environment, to pick up these signs and symptoms of burnout and other signs and symptoms of psychological workplace awareness that we need to be mindful of, that we might not otherwise see within the wider group and organizational context. Is there anything you would add to that, Nicky?
The only thing that was going through my mind, Jayne, was that for senior colleagues, that person that they're speaking to on a regular basis may need to be someone external from the organisation.
Yes. Yeah.
And I've seen that in practice too. They just don't want people inside to know anything in terms of that vulnerability. But when it's someone safe and external, then they can really open up and get that support.
Absolutely.
Okay. Have you got any tips for helping leaders develop approaches for self-care and dealing with the negativity that is often directed at those at the forefront of change?
What a great question.
Yeah.
Nicky, do you want me to go for that first?
Yeah, go for it.
So where shall I start with that question? I feel like there's a couple of points there that I'd want to address. So there's the approaches for self-care, and then there's the dealing with the negativity that is often directed. I think if I was to start with the latter half of that question, the dealing with the negativity that is often directed at those at the forefront of change. So again, kind of coming back to the value and importance of having a peer group support within the change leadership context is really valuable. So to think about how you're creating opportunity for leaders who are going through the change and who are likely all to a certain extent going to be experiencing some of that resistance, negativity, pushback, taking the brunt of some of that emotional response that their colleagues might be experiencing through change. Having some peer support set up where, again, the focus is on how we are feeling about the change and the challenges that we're facing from a personal perspective, how we are approaching it rather than what we're achieving professionally. That is a really valuable tool and resource to put in place for leaders so that they have an opportunity to work through that negativity, because I think sometimes what you find happens is they will sit and hold that negativity as a reflection of their management and leadership capability or style. And they may not even necessarily be aware that that is what they're doing. Some maybe more so than others, but at some subconscious level, that may be what they're doing and how they are interpreting that. So to know that they are not alone in that challenge is incredibly valuable. And again, to echo Nicky's point on if that support is not available internally, then external support and external leadership networks might be something that they might want to explore as well. Tips for helping leaders develop approaches for self-care. Now, I think, back to self-care being very unique to each of us based on what brings us joy, what nourishes and nurtures us. I think to encourage leaders to really think about doing something that they know brings them joy and that they enjoy doing. And actually almost setting that as a leadership ask and request that they give themselves permission and time to do that, and that organizationally we're encouraging that and we're prioritizing that. That I think can be a really helpful way of actually getting leaders to take a step back and think about what really does matter to them and what self-care looks like for them personally. Anything you'd add, Nicky?
I think just the only thing again on that was that most of us know what we need to do. Most of us know we need to eat better and exercise, and maybe the focus is more on why we don't do that, which links to values and how we may have let our values change and slip over a period of time. So conversations around that, as opposed to some great wellbeing initiatives that I've seen inside corporate around the things we should do. Most of us know. So probably the deeper conversations around why we don't and what we're prioritizing instead would be beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just conscious of time, Jane, so maybe one more.
Super.
And this one really jumps out to me. I feel like I want to answer this today. How can I support my employees who are burned out when I'm burned out too? I would say prioritize yourself initially, because it's a cliche, but we cannot pour from an empty cup. So get the support that you need for you first, and know that by doing that, the changes that evokes in you, there will be a ripple effect on the people around you, not just at work, but at home as well. So if you are burned out, if you're recognizing some of this in yourself, the worst thing you can do is nothing.
I'd echo that entirely, Nicky, and throwing in another analogy just to make that point stick. It's a bit like the airplane analogy of putting your own oxygen mask on first before helping others. You know, that really is important. And not only is that important for your own well-being, but if your team can see that that is what you are doing, then you're role modeling, putting yourself first too, which is an incredibly powerful thing as a leader to be role modeling. So look after yourself first, but think about, by doing that, it's not a selfish act in any way at all, because the ripple effect of you doing that is going to be massive.
Really.
Thank you. We'll make sure that we keep a note of all the other questions that have come in, and hopefully we can find a way to make sure that we answer all of those as part of our follow-up communication after today's session. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I really do hope that you've found the session valuable. Please do get in touch if we can offer any additional support or guidance. And we hope to see you at another Changing Point webinar soon. Thank you very much.